I also wanted to mention that there's a kind of sense of entrepreneurship in the work that we do that I think is really important, and people really taking initiative. And I think that's happening both here and in other parts of the world. And more, some of these exciting projects are happening with American artists and artists in other places that are created not necessarily through government agency, but on their own. And so finding ways to support that work while still respecting the kind of bottom-up aspect that respects that kind of entrepreneurship and initiative taking, I think is really important. I'm going to end with just some of the principles and strategies that we have started to develop as a part of this project, which I will mention will have a public launch that creates parity and equity between and among collaborators. Again, that's the kind of ground-up idea, consultation, sharing of information, and it may seem obvious. I think we just have to keep reminding ourselves, because there are so many ideas and sometimes things come from on top, and they don't give the space, the breathing space that will allow for the kind of innovation. Number 2, cultural initiatives and advocacy work needs sustained investment over a long duration. I think this is critical. These efforts take many years, and they're indeed an investment. So I think that, if you look at the Silk Road project, it's now, I think, in its 11th year. That impact is in part because it's had that kind of space to make that ongoing relationship. I think the real sad fact is that all too many of these efforts are sort of, they're wonderful, and then it's on to the next one. So I think some sense of long-term is really important. We've said 5 to 7 years as a minimum. Number 3, powerful forces for social change are linked to the invention of new technologies. I mean, obviously, printing press, internet, cell phones, all of this. We want to use these new technologies for connectivity, while at the same time really supporting the people-to-people exchange. Number 4, rather than viewing cultural production as a mechanism for monetizing creativity, culture should be viewed as a unique form of social currency that can serve as a positive force in building community. And I think that's a place where we all struggle. The film industry was mentioned earlier, while at the same time there's so much local film that's now emerging. How do we find a way for there to be space for all of this? And finally, people need direct access to each other, peer-to-peer. After connecting, you learn about new ways of looking at the world, about different ways. Again, developing new forms of people-to-people connectivity. All of these are ideas that we're already, I think, supporting in some ways, but part of this is making it really explicit. And to say, this is a series of strategies that we strongly feel need to be in front of us as we do our work. I think I'm going to stop there, but I will also be interested in any questions and happy to talk to any of you.
Thank you very much, Rachel. And now the last word before we get into discussion goes to Eduardo.
Good morning to everyone, and thank you for being here. There are 2 key words connected with Don Quixote, and these are freedom and tolerance. Instituto Cervantes was founded quite recently, 20 years ago, less than that, by the Spanish government. So it came late because the other cultural institutions created by European governments had been in action for much longer than that, like the French Alliance or the British Council or the Goethe Institute or the Italian Institute. Instituto Cervantes holds 72 centers worldwide, and its strength in the 5 continents, and its strength is directly derived of the strength of the Spanish language, which plays a fundamental role today globally. And there are new centers in Africa, in Asia, one in Australia. But I find that the real challenge, I mean, there are many, there's an important role that Instituto Cervantes is playing, for instance, in the Arab world, where it is really very well received, because there's a perception that there's a deep connection between Spain and the Arab world. Just to give an example. But I feel that it is in the United States where there is a central role that we can play in terms of cultural diplomacy. And this is because of a number of factors. Right now, our presence is really minimal. There are only 3 centers, one in New York, one in Chicago, and one in Albuquerque. In Albuquerque, there is one because the federal government of the United States gave a space to Instituto Cervantes so that they could use it. But the role there is very small right now. If tomorrow the Spanish government had money to found or to create 50 Instituto Cervantes, there would be a problem because they would be working full speed ahead from day one. I remember attending a conference in Atlanta when I was recently. I had been appointed, and they were telling me that the French Alliance were giving Spanish language classes in places like Boston and things like that. But what is happening is very profound, really, and I'll give a few details. At some point during the 21st century, the country with the largest number of Spanish language speakers will be the United States, over Mexico, according to statistical projections, and just mind the next results of the census. Secondly, well, that is a very important factor. But secondly, Spanish is not a foreign language in the United States, and it has never been. It actually, in what is the actual territory of the United States, the first written records were in Spanish in the 16th century in Florida, the first chronicles. We should not forget that in 1848, the United States and Mexico signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, by virtue of which half of the national territory of Mexico was given to the United States, which explains why all those names, like Colorado, Nevada, San Francisco, Los Angeles, San Diego, you name them. And that also explains the strength of some kind of Hispanic culture in this country. This has changed and continues to change with the continual influx of immigrants. This does not stop, not even during the crisis. And this is constantly changing the landscape, making it stronger. And there is a fierce allegiance to Spanish language and to Hispanic culture by Latinos. The capital, the cultural capital of Latin America is New York City. Because in Buenos Aires you get Argentinians, in Mexico City you get Mexicans, in Bogota Colombians, in Lima Peruvians, and here everyone. And a new cultural identity is acquiring a new shape in this country, and this must be connected with what I said before about the strength of Spanish language. Language is just an aspect, and it's subject to controversy, because there's one very serious thesis that says, well, remember when there were 400,000 or so, I don't know the figures exactly, of Yiddish speakers in this country, they all get assimilated, the language is wiped out, everybody will speak in English. That is not what is happening with the United States, with Spanish in the United States. That is not what is happening with Spanish in New York City. Just go out and listen. The language is alive there. And it is growing because the newcomers don't speak English. And that is part of the strength of our role here. I feel that what I have to do, what we have to do is huge, it's immense. There are many, many challenges that we confront. One of them is that although we are funded by the government of Spain and I have a diplomatic mandate, I and my predecessors make a point of being very aware of the real situation here. It is a mistake to focus only on one country when the strength of the Spanish language lies in the fact that it is the official language of 22 countries in Latin America. And there's a third component, which is the new identity that is being created here, which is called Latino. Who are Latinos? This is exactly what I was saying before. We can discuss the issue of the denomination of Hispanic versus Latino. But what is happening here, and also in a new kind of language that I think, and this is a very bold hypothesis, is being created here, a variety of Spanish is being forged in the United States, the US Spanish. I see this because I traveled to Chicago and I meet the cultural forces there. And they tell me, we have this newspaper, which is new. And the guy who is talking to me may be Argentinian or Colombian or Peruvian. I went to Seattle because we have a so-called aula, which means literally classroom, and what it is an embryo of a future Instituto Cervantes. Right now, there are not resources to create them. Again, as I said, if the Spanish government had them, it would be really something difficult to control because we are facing a huge demand, and not only in terms of the language. So these people of Hispanic origin, and there are many communities, only in New York City, I think there are like 1 million Mexicans, but go to Queens and you will see the colonies of Salvadorans, for instance, Central Americans in general, go to Washington, D.C. So what happens is that they mingle, they get together, they share a cultural vision, and they feel part of something that they all share, which is a historical past and, history of colonization, independence, etc. So when it was mentioned before that I translated a book by Junot Diaz, who was the winner, not the finalist of the Pulitzer Prize, I did, and into Spanish. This is extremely interesting. He has a strong political commitment to Latino culture and identity, but he does not speak Spanish and cannot write in Spanish like many other Latino writers of the United States, Sandra Cisneros, Oscar Hijuelos, who won the Pulitzer Prize 18 years before Junot Diaz. So he does not really speak the language. When somebody approached me from Vintage Español and said, would you translate this book into Spanish? And I did. Not so much out of literary interest, it's a very interesting book, it's the first collection of short stories drawn, but because the challenge was, into what kind of Spanish am I going to translate this? And I began to do this, and I'm not going to describe the process, but I saw myself, and this is why I hold the hypothesis that a new variety of Spanish is being created here, because I had to create this kind of language in my own version of the text. And this is what happens to many others who have to translate works by Chicanos into a variety of, into Spanish, and it has to be a general Spanish. Also, the 22 Spanish-speaking nations get together and they hold conferences on the future of language. The last one had to be cancelled because of the earthquake. They were all already in Chile, but you all know what happened there, so it had to be cancelled. But what it is that scholars, writers, and governments are working very closely to make sure that Spanish language is in good shape, so to speak. I like to talk about the word Latino is very interesting because a very important phenomenon is taking place here in the United States, which is exactly the opposite of what happened with Latin many centuries ago. What happened with Latin in the Middle Ages is that it was the lingua franca, which is what English is now, of the world, of the then known world. But due to the reality of the new nations, it broke up into new, beautiful, so-called Romance languages, French, Catalan, Spanish, Italian, all those languages were born because Latin was artificial and it could not be held together just because it was the language of the church and of the university. Nowadays, the opposite process is taking place with Spanish, which is that the different nations, and technology plays a very important role here, are looking at each other, and all the terms travel towards the different nations from the different nations. And this is what happened on the page of the book. I was translated by Junot Diaz, and this is what is happening in the United States. If you watch the TV programs of CNN, they have a real problem, which is the problem I had as a translator. In what language are we going to address, in what Spanish variety are we going to address our audience? It cannot be Puerto Rican, it cannot be Mexican. So we cultural institutions, private companies like CNN, have to find a solution. And it's very interesting to observe the anchors and how they speak and the instructions they are given in terms of what vocabulary to avoid, what vocabulary to use, what syntax, what grammar. So this is a reflection of the other two aspects I mentioned before. The strength of Spanish language in this country, which is natural, not artificial. And I believe that the government has a very little role to play here. It doesn't make any sense if a state says English only, because at home the immigrants are not going to be affected. If they don't speak English, they are not going to learn by decree overnight. They will have to continue to communicate with the family in the language that they know. And we at Instituto Cervantes here in New York have approximately 4,000 students of English. And why do we have them? There is a huge difference between Spanish and other, so to speak, language of cultural prestige of European origin, like German or Italian or French. Spanish is different only because of one factor. It traveled across the Atlantic, came to America, and began really a second life here, which is what gives it strength. So that's what makes it different from Italian, for example, the fact that all these Latin American nations share this language of culture and communication. And this is what really is happening in the United States. Cervantes, Instituto Cervantes has, as you can see, many challenges. The task is enormous. We basically have one of the best Spanish language library in the country. Our library, we are located on 49th Street off 3rd Avenue, and we conduct a huge variety of cultural activities. But like in everything that I have been describing in my little talk now, we more or less try to accommodate to the real needs out there. I remember that there used to be two bookstores on 14th Street, the Spanish language bookstores, Lectorum and Macondo. They have been wiped away. And somebody from the New York Times called me to ask me how I felt about that. And I gave them my opinion. What was very interesting is that the journalist said, Instituto Cervantes, a Latin American cultural organization. I got many calls saying, are you going to talk to them? Are you going to complain? Are you going to protest? I was elated because it meant that we are perceived as what I want us to be, as an entity.